Okay, continuing on now. I'm discussing the Amalekites in my video series entitled Genocide in the Bible, and we're basically looking into the details surrounding 1 Samuel chapter 15. Now I want to address another question as we move closer to actually dealing with the passage. Doesn't this event fit into the anti-biblical pattern of punishing the children for the sins of the parents? Typically, criminal actions by parents don't always affect the lives of their children, but in modern day cultures, we often shield children from some of the consequences of the actions of their parents. For example, in the modern world, the families of prisoners do not go to prison with a man or woman because we have social institutions that can provide for base level care for them, which was totally unlike the ancient world. Even in exceptionally socially conscious civilizations, such as ancient Israel, the plight of the widow or the fatherless was precarious enough, but in extreme conditions, such as migration, warfare, famine, it was impossible. But even in our world, the principle of the families of the criminals suffer too is very, very obvious. There are ministries and social outreach services that specially target the tormented world of children of those who have been imprisoned or who have committed crime or have done something that basically has affected the child in a very direct way. They live on, but the consequences of their parents' destructive behavior takes its toll. There are two important points that need to be made clear here. The relationship between the sins of the father and the sins of the children, and the relationship between the sin of the ruler, king, leader, and the sins of the people or followers. The first point I want to deal with is the sins of the fathers and the sins of the children. In the Old Testament, when a descendant is punished for the sins of the father, it is normally referring to the sinning in the same way or character as their fathers, not punishment for the actual acts of their fathers. The biblical expression for this is walking in the sins or walking in the ways of the fathers. A couple passages, if you can read, will show this. Look at 1 Kings chapter 15, chapter 16, and chapter 22. What this principle shows is that the phrase sins of X would generally mean, when applied to a descendant of X, means sins just like X did. In other words, so when we see sins of the father, sins of the children, what we're reading is sins just like the sins of the father, or sins just like the sins of the children, and so on. Okay? Now, point two, the relationship between the sin of the ruler king and the sins of the people and followers. Again, this is closely related to the first point, and that is the principle of the sins of the king X could easily mean sins like King X, or sins by the people instigated by King X. A very detailed case of this interaction between the ruler father and follower descendants can be seen in the final judgment of Judah. The biblical texts sometimes ascribe the judgment to the specific sins of Manasseh and sometimes to the sins of Judah, and sometimes both. In all cases, though, the character of the sins are identical. The idolatrous religious practices, including shedding of innocent blood through child sacrifice, the like X principle. Their principles again show how this makes sense in such a culture. I would encourage you to look at 2 Kings chapter 21, chapter 23, chapter 24, 2 Chronicles 33, and Jeremiah 15. Now, so when we apply this understanding to the Amalekites, a similar theme can be detected in the biblical text. Some of the judgment passages focus on the initial specific cruelties of the original Amalekites, and some focus on the present day recapitulations of those cruelties, just like the sins of their fathers, in other words. So when we're saying walking in the sins of the fathers, we're talking about just sins just like the sins of their fathers. So the sins of X data founders would come from Deuteronomy chapter 25 verse 17. Remember that Amalek did to you along when you came out of Egypt, how he met along the way and attacked among you all the stragglers, your rear, and when you were faint and weary, and he did not fear God. And the like sins of X data can be seen in Judges chapter 10:10, when the Amalekites oppressed you, or 1 Samuel 14, when the Amalekites plundered them, and 1 Samuel 15:1-2, he set himself against him, you will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel, how he set himself against him on the way while he was coming out of Egypt. Now, notice this posture statement as opposed to just an event statement. This being said against Israel was ruthlessly maintained from generation to generation. Look at 1 Samuel 17:15. What emerges from this analysis is that any cruel culpability of a warrior Amalekites at the time of Saul was more an issue of walking in the sins of their fathers than merely some ancient event. In other words, the Amalekites during the times of Saul were doing the same things that the Amalekites were doing back 400 years earlier in Deuteronomy chapter 25. The fact that the Amalekites could be assimilated into Israel without execution points out that there is an actual character of an individual that made the difference back then. In other words, if the original cruel act of Amalek was the only criteria, then immigrants would be killed and not accepted. Okay, so this general principle of focus, this general principle is the focus of Ezekiel 18, of course, and makes this explicit, even though Israel complains against God about this. Now, Ezekiel 18 says, "Yet you, Israel, say, why should the son not bear the punishment of the father's iniquity? When the son has practiced justice and righteousness, and has observed all my statutes and done them, he shall surely live. The person who sins will die. The son will not bear the punishment of the father's iniquity, nor the father bear the punishment of the son's iniquity. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked will be upon himself." Verse 21. "But if the wicked man turns from all his sins which he has committed, and observes all my statutes and practices justice and righteousness, he shall surely live, he shall not die. All his transgressions which he has committed will not be remembered against him, because of the righteousness which he has practiced he will live. Do I have any pleasure of the death of the wicked, declares the Lord, rather that he should turn from his ways and live." Now, someone might ask, well, but aren't individuals supposed to be punished for their own misdeeds only, and not the misdeeds of others? Refer to Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 16, 2 Kings chapter 14, verse 1. The answer is absolutely, but we need not make the assumption that the killing of dependents was a punishment upon them per se, as opposed to a consequence of the punishment on their fathers. Morally, there is a huge difference. To illustrate how this works, consider the case of Rahab in Jericho that you can read about in the book of Joshua. Everybody in the city, everybody in Jericho knows to flee. They have known this for a long time, and only the unreasonable remain to fight, or the unable. The king may have forced some to remain in the city against their will, perhaps even Rahab. But the passage dealing with Rahab's deliverance shows how the family connectedness works for good or ill. In this case, the sparing of the lives of the family of Rahab had nothing to do with their innocence. If they stayed in the house, their lives would be spared as a consequence of the reverse judgment on Rahab, not as a reverse judgment on themselves. In this case, their being spared was only a consequence of being related to another Rahab and being in a close enough relationship to her to listen to her pleas to stay inside. The notion of blood as responsibility for someone's death leads us in an important direction. Execution of a criminal was legally self-caused. And I'm going to pick up on this in the next video.